How important are fathers?
Fathers are immensely important simply because fathers are not mothers. And this is another politically incorrect thing to say nowadays. On the whole, and it's a generalization, parent differently from mothers. Their love tends to be more qualified, rough and tumble, justice, rules and regulations are more the sort of things that come to fathers naturally. And of course, their simple physical size and the basic tone of their voice has a different evolutionary and biological effect upon their children, certainly when it comes to discipline and reinforcing authority. Now, more important than that, when you want to look at evidence, is the fact that when you look, for example, at girls that grow up with their biological fathers as opposed to girls that don't, they reach puberty later. They're less likely to get pregnant. And many of the other things that parents are concerned about are different when you have a biological father present. Of course, it's still better to have a father present, but biological fathers in particular. Now, part of the reason may be chemical and evolutionary. The fact that a father is around causes chemical changes in their daughter which delay puberty. There's an evolutionary theory that if a daughter doesn't have her father around, in primitive times, she had less protection. She'd better reproduce quickly, reach puberty and reproduce quickly, because she may die and her genes will not be passed on. While if her father was around, she could afford to wait a bit later to reach puberty and then to have children. So there is a link between fathers, puberty, age of puberty, sexual intercourse, and pregnancy. They play an important role. They're very pregnancy unfriendly, fathers are. And of course, if boys come to the door, having a male figure there who has an invested evolutionary biological interest in his daughter, it counts big when it comes to your daughter, preventing your daughter from getting pregnant. It might not seem fair. It is the way it is, politically incorrect or not. When it comes to boys, they desperately need male role models, and a lot of them don't have it. So boys in single-parent families are suffering. Not that it's blaming the mothers at all if they happen to be single mothers. This is not what this discussion is about. It's about child well-being. And those boys end up with male role models on offer through the media. You're talking about violent hip-hop rap videos, wrestling on television, strong, arresting male figures on the screen count big with boys who don't have real role models in their day-to-day lives at home. So there are reasons why fathers are desperately important, and for girls as well. They need to deal with real boys, real fiancés, real husbands, real men in society. This sort of education is a subtle long-term thing which comes best from a father.
So why is it then that dads have been so sidelined? I mean, many fathers feel that they really are pretty much surplus to requirements.
I think that with feminism came a distortion of what equality for women meant, and it was hijacked by certain, political interests. And in short, we were first told as men and women that we're a genderless society, that in fact the sexes are somewhat interchangeable, and they're just labels, and that really, if I behave differently from my wife, it's just because I've been conditioned differently. That just isn't true. And with that, of course, is that if men and women are reasonably interchangeable, mothers and fathers are reasonably interchangeable. And once you say that, you then say, well, do you really need to have a father around? I mean, it's nice to have one, but I mean, how necessary are they really? And with that, of course, comes the issue of child contact. When parents separate or divorce, is a father a necessity for a child? And what you find, for example, in Britain, is that we have an agency which forces the father to pay money to support the child because society values a father's money. But there isn't a similar organization to force mothers to allow the child to see the father. If there's no problem and the father's a good father and the mother wants to make it difficult, there's no agency that will help the father. So the society is being told, they're sending the message to everyone, fathers, we value your money, but we don't value your existence or your presence in a child's life. This is an appalling state of affairs. It's a catastrophic state, and what it will do for the generation of children that are growing up now is something very sad, I'm afraid to say.
You mentioned television and the images of men that we see on TV, which are obviously very strong, even though they're fantasy figures. You've got quite strong thoughts on television and children. You'd say, for instance, is under threes shouldn't see television.
I have interests primarily not with what children are watching on television. That's a huge problem already. It's how many hours a day are being spent in the virtual world and how many hours a day are being spent in the real world looking at real people. This is now a biological issue, and the issue is based upon what we call in the medical field a dose-response relationship. We now know that the number of hours children spent in front of a screen, whether it's television or otherwise, cause chemical and metabolic changes in those children, certainly during the lower years. And so, for example, in France, the French government has outlawed the broadcast of all television programs to children under 3 because they're convinced by the medical evidence that it is not good for developing children. By the way, child development, the brain development, is greatest. 80% of brain development occurs between birth and 3 years old. When you then look at simple things like social skills and empathy and consideration, there's now very compelling evidence that the time that children had spent on screens when they were developing prevented them from learning how their parents and others react when they say things. So they're not learning to be sensitive, because when they say things, they can watch your eyebrows and your facial muscles and your body stance, and they can listen to the subtleties in your voice, and they need to go through that process to learn how to be sensitive and to learn empathy. And there's now a generation who has, in medical terms, less empathy than they did before the year 2000. And in Britain, 3-year-olds, 50% of 3-year-olds have their own TV set in their bedroom. By the age of 5, they will own their own computers. Most of them will have broadband access. And with that comes a phenomenal amount of screen time. And this may resonate over here fairly soon. The average 11 to 15-year-old in Britain will spend, on average, 7.5 hours a day in front of a screen. That's 55% of their waking lives in front of a screen. And any Christians listening now should realize there's a link between feeding your children stimulation and preventing them thereon from being able to connect with religion and with God, because turning inward, not outward to advertisements and stimulation and television programs and toys, but cutting all that off and turning inward and communing with a greater force is best brought about by giving them the gift of boredom when they're young, allowing them to get fed up and bored so that it forces them to get themselves out of it. And you might see them frustrated and disappointed at first. That's good. That's a necessary part of their development. But if I could say anything, please give our children the gift of boredom. Don't hand them stimulation and entertainment on a plate, because you'll rob them of the ability to entertain themselves thereafter.
It's fascinating to talk to you, Aric. Thank you very much indeed.
Real pleasure.